Sukkah, Daf from Lamed through Lamed Vav. Third parak, Lulav HaGazel, begins at the end of Daf Chav Tesim Beis. The Mishnah said, Lulav HaGazel v'Yavesh Pasel. Stolen Lulav is Pasel. So the Gemara wants to know why. So the Gemara initially says, the first day at least, we understand the problem is, it says Lachem, L'kachtem Lachem, Mishalachem, it has to be yours. Yom Tov Sheni, other days of Yom Tov, Lachem doesn't apply. So what's the problem? So the Gemara proposes another reason why a stolen lulav is pasul, and that is mitzvah haba ba'avera. A mitzvah fulfilled by doing an avera is not valid. Tosas, poskim have a couple of limitations on the scope of this principle, mitzvah haba ba'avera. Tosas says the Mishnah also talks about lulav shel asherah v'shel nidachas, used for avodah zarah of different types. And the Gemara says, the Mishnah said it's possible, but the Gemara says a different reason. Not because of mitzvah bavera, but because of ksusim mechta shiura. It's as if it's missing the shear, because you have to destroy it, you have to burn it. What happened to mitzvah bavera? So Tosfos says, just because you did an avera with something in the past, mitzvah has nothing to do with that. This thing was worshipped, it was an asherah in the past, okay, that has nothing to do with the mitzvah I'm doing now. So that wouldn't be called mitzvah bavera. Later, Tosfos says another limitation. Tosfos says, based on our Gemara, other Gemaras, Tosfos says, mitzvah ba'avera is only when, by performing the mitzvah, that is that has to do with the avera. Tosfos says that when you talk about stealing, if you already stole it and yeush kediyus kana, yeush is kona, it already became yours before the avera, before the mitzvah, the fact that it was once stolen, that wouldn't be a problem, even though it came into your possession by stealing it. But the fact that it already became yours, Yeush already occurred, and Yeush is Kona by itself, according to that opinion, and it was already yours before the Avera, that would not be mitzvah b'avera. When our Gemara says mitzvah b'avera, it's only that when you take the lulav, when you take the lulav, that's when the mitzvah occurs. That's the problem, mitzvah b'avera. And that's how the Shulchan Aruch paskins. Of course, we do paskin that lulav hagazul is pasul. However, the Shulchan Aruch says that it's pasul bein lifnei yesh bein la'achar yesh. But however, he says if you stole it and you were kona it without the mitzvah, you stole it, you did a shini masa, you did some action to it that made it yours, then it's already yours before the mitzvah. Even though it got into your possession by stealing it, that's not mitzvah b'avera. The Mishnah Berurah explains if the kinyan occurred before the kiyum ha-mitzvah, then it's not mitzvah b'avera. It's only if by picking up the lulav, then it's only that by picking up the lulav your kona, then that's mitzvah b'avera. If the thief sells it to you and you're kona it b'mashicha and you pick it up to be yotze, then the avera is in the act of the mitzvah. That's mitzvah b'avera. The only way to avoid that would be to pick it up first and be kona it. And the way to avoid it is not to use a stolen lulav. But if you're using a stolen lulav, the way it would work is if you first picked it up and were kona it, and then you use it later. So mitzvah haba b'avera is a fairly narrow principle. However, in the broader sense, poskim invoke it, rabbanim invoke it in a much more powerful sense that it's hypocritical, it's ridiculous, it's wrong to do a mitzvah, to associate a mitzvah with an avera. They bring from a Yisrael Salanter that he would warn people, especially about B'nadam Lachavero, he would warn people about not being pious vis-a-vis HaKadosh Baruch Hu and behaving improperly toward one's fellow man. Certainly he says things like fighting about aliyos and so on. We're not even talking about that. Fighting about mitzvahs, that goes without saying, is wrong. But even he says tzaddikim and chasidim who wouldn't do such a thing, he says, even then he says it's quite conceivable how they would do this type of mitzvah b'avera. He gives an example, various examples, common examples. Elul, he would say, people get up early, chatzos, or very early to daven slichos. He says sometimes people are so pious about doing slichos they can violate many averas, 7 averas. He says they make a big commotion in their house. They wake up their household who are not ready to get up. Or other people who live nearby. That's not right. Sometimes there are sick people and children. He causes them tsar by all his bustle to get out for slichas. Sometimes he demands and harasses his maid, his household help, to make him tea when he gets up so early in the morning. And if the servant is an orphan or a widow, which is often or usually the case, there's another law called mana v'yasim lo sa'anun. Sometimes he's in such a rush that he spills out the water in a public place, which is a michshol that can cause people to get hurt. When he gets to shul, if he doesn't find his shtender in the right place, he yells at the shamash for not setting things up properly. he violates Lashon Hara and humiliating someone publicly. Sometimes, and similar things, someone who was learning all night, he bothers him, and he invaza Talmud Chacham and causes him anguish. So all these things, he violates terrible avin just because he wants to do this pious thing of davening slichas. There's another famous example that Rabbi Yisrael once, it was Erev Yom Kippur, he was going to shul for Maariv, and he had to, and he met a great chassid, a great pious person, and this person was clearly so worried about the din, the framework of awe and nervousness about the din, fear of the Yom HaDin. Rabbi Yisrael had to ask him an important question. So this person, because of his great nervousness and terror of the din, he didn't even answer Rabbi Yisrael. Rabbi Yisrael said to himself, why do I have to suffer because he's such a Yireh Shemayim? He says, good, he has Yireh and Ra'ada for the Yom HaDin. What does that have to do with me, he says? When you look at me, you have to treat me like a person. If I ask you a question, you have to have respect for me. You have to have derech eretz for me. He says, you can't just be so wrapped up in your avodas Hashem that you ignore me. Shimon Schwab was always very concerned with Chil Hashem and with frum people behaving in a way that brings credit to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Torah. He was very upset about people who would cheat or people who would cause a Chil Hashem in their B'nadin L'Chavera, but were very frum, were very pious, B'nadin L'Makam. He talks about the incredible hypocrisy if someone cheats his neighbor or the government, and then he says Kaddish, which is a prayer for Kiddush Hashem. What audacity, what a shame, he says. Can there be a worse contradiction than the strict Shabbos observer? And he's also a stickler for kashrus. At the same time, he violates the spirit of kashrus and Shabbos during the week with non-kosher money manipulations. And he calls it mitzvah ba'avera. He says, even if the person who has these terrible antisocial behavior, gross materialism, blatant selfishness, insatiable love of wealth, brazen disregard for common decency, even if, strangely enough, he says, as it sometimes happens, these ugly traits go together with excessive charity and benevolence, this type of twisted ethics he calls mitzvah ba'avera. Again, whether he and Rabbi Yisrael, whether in the technical, narrow, halachic sense of mitzvah ba'avera, perhaps not, but certainly in the spirit of the thing, this is mitzvah ba'avera. On Daf Lamed Aleph, the Gemara continues to discuss the problem of stealing. The Gemara turns to Sukkah Gzula. If you steal a Sukkah, or of a Masachet Rishus Harabim, you build your Sukkah, you put schach in a public domain, it's not yours. Rabbi Eliezer Posel, Chachamim Machshir. This is a Machlokes Tanoim. We pass like the Chachamim that the Sukkah is kosher. The way it's brought in Shulchan Aruch is Yotzim b'Sukkah Shula. First of all, there's a Machlokes whether you can eat in a borrowed Sukkah. Of course, we know that you can. You're a guest, or you borrow a Sukkah for Yantif. Of course, we paskin, it's Machlokes, but we paskin la halacha that you can be Yotzei in a borrowed Sukkah. Moreover, we paskin that you're Yotzei b'Sukkah Gzula. If a person has a Sukkah and you just throw him out of his Sukkah and you sit there, then you're Yotzei because Eina Karka Nigzelis. The Mishnah Berurah explains that we don't actually paskin that Sukkah Gzula is Ksher. Sukkah Gzula is Psula. The reason if you steal a Sukkah, an already built Sukkah, or a piece of real estate and build a Sukkah, or a public domain, the reason these cases are your Yotzei is because since Karka and Nigzelis is a rule that real property always belongs to its original owner, you can't really steal it, the property stays where it is, the records are still where they are. The fact that you're forcibly occupying it, al pi halacha, that's not called Gzela, it's wrong, it's an Aveira of Gzela maybe, but the property doesn't acquire the status of Gzula, and therefore that's not called a Sukkah Gzula. So if you evict somebody from a Sukkah, or if you build a Sukkah on property that's not yours, we paskin that b'diavad you Yotzei, the Sukkah is Ksheira and you Yotzei the mitzvah. However, the Ramah adds, l'chatchila lo yeshiv adam b'sukkah chaver shlomi daito. Even when you're not stealing, even just using a Sukkah without explicit permission, you shouldn't do. And certainly, if you're trying to steal his Sukkah, you shouldn't do it. And l'chatchila, you shouldn't make a Sukkah on someone else's property, someone else's yard, without his permission. And similarly, you should not l'chatchila make a Sukkah on public property. However, b'diavad yata. B'diavad, we said, this kind of Sukkah Gzula, you're Yotzei, so b'diavad, all these cases, you're Yotzei. But l'chatchila, you shouldn't do this. L'chatchila, you shouldn't build a Sukkah even merely without permission, certainly against his will, certainly with intent to steal it, and you shouldn't build a Sukkah on public property. So, the Achronim discuss a Magen Avram. Magen Avram says that in his time, the minhag was people would build Sukkahs in Rishus Harabim. Maybe you'll tell me the Jews understand, the Jews know it's necessary, so they're mochel, he says. The non-Jews are not mochel. The Rishus Harabim belongs to them as well. They don't give permission, he says. So it's usher. He says, you're not allowed to do that. The non-Jews don't allow you to do it, and you can't do it. It's stealing, he says. Even if the Ramah said, b'diavad, it's ksheira. Sukkah and Exelis, but Diavad, you'll be Yotze. You can't make a bracha. And the Magen Avraham says it's a bracha levatela. Mishnah Berurah brings that other Akronim say it's not bracha levatela. It's a big machlokas. Many Akronim say it's not bracha levatela. So la halacha, some of them say you could make a bracha, but the Lamaisa, the poskim agree that you should not build a sukkah on someone else's property or on public property without permission. Now, these earlier Akronim were talking about building a sukkah on property that you have no permission to use, your friend's property or public property. What about your property? That because of government regulation, you're not allowed to build a sukkah there, either for safety reasons or for aesthetic reasons, different types of zoning restrictions. What about building a sukkah in a place that you shouldn't be building a sukkah, but it's on your own property? But some Akronim are still machmer. Some Akronim say, l'chatchila, you still can't do that. Rav Yitzchak Zilberstein brings from his father-in-law, Rav Elyashiv. Rav Elyashiv said, once the government says no, that you're not allowed to build there, even if it's just for aesthetic reasons, not even safety. If it's illegal, he says, it's gezel. That's called stealing, and that is the din of sukkah gzula. Again, but B'diavad we pass in karka and exelis, but B'diavad maybe you'll be yotze, but you're not allowed to do it. L'chatchila, you're certainly not allowed to build such a sukkah and be yotze in such a sukkah. There are others who take a similar position. There's a tshuva in the Sefer Oel Yosef, of Rav Yosef Eliyahu Fried. He was talking about building a sukkah on a fire escape, which is against the law and it's not safe. And he says you absolutely can't do that. There's no basis for allowing such a thing. He says it's dangerous. He says it's wrong and it's dangerous. He says, and everyone the fire escape, everyone has the right to have clear fire escapes. He says, and they're not mochel, and it's against the law. He says the law requires those spaces be kept clear. And he says that even in Rishus Rabbim, he says, where you don't know that they're mach, but you just don't have permission, kol shkein here, it's an explicit law. You're not allowed to build a sukkah here. It's dangerous. They don't want you to build a sukkah here, he says. So he says that you're not allowed to do this. He says you're absolutely not allowed to do this, he says, and chas v'shalom, it could cause danger if there's a fire. You can't make a bracha on such a sukkah. You can't mention Shem Hashem in a place where you're using someone else's property. Again, since it's against the law, he says, and it's dangerous, he says, V'adai al pi din Torah shalanu asukah psula ve'ein levarech al sukkah kazos. So that is his position. And he says, mitzvah gedola, it's a great mitzvah to mefarsim this, to publicize this, that it's asr al pi din Torah and al pi the law to build sukkahs on the fire escapes. Other poskim, though, are more tolerant. Rav Adi Hadaya, the Askil Avdi, he says it's fine. He says all this concern. Again, I don't think he would say it if he felt it was actively dangerous. He says, but the fact that it's against the law, he says, the whole idea of sukkah gzula is when it's not your property, or when it's public property, when it's your neighbor's property, but it's your own property. He said, even if it's against the law, that would not give it a din of sukkah gzula. Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt and Riv Ephraim makes a similar point at the end of it. He brings it from the Debertiner and Moshe Stern, that he says, the Din Malchus, it's against the law. He says, but that's not gzela. It is your property. He says, you can't call that theft if it's your property. You can call it illegal, but you can't call that against the law, he says. He says the sukkah would not be puzzled, so this is a machlokes. But Tzvi Reisman of Los Angeles has a long essay on this. He spoke to Rav Asher Weiss about it. Rav Asher Weiss wrote him a response, which he publishes and is also printed in the Minchas Asher of Rav Weiss. Rav Weiss has a long discussion about this question of whether, first of all, whether Din Malchusa applies outside the scope of financial regulation, even to safety regulations. He's inclined to say that it does. He changed his mind about it, but his conclusion is that it does. But then he says it's not really gzela. He says when you do something that the government doesn't want you to do, he says even if it's for a good reason and you're bound to listen to it, he says, but it's not based on a property right the government has. It's based on a right they have to regulate society. Again, you can't call that theft, like the svara, similar to the svara of the Askil Avdi and the Riv Ephraim. You can't call that gzela. He says he doesn't even think you'd call mitzvah ba'avera, because even though it's the right thing to do, it's the ratzon HaTorah, he says, to listen to the government, it is the right thing to do, you can't call that an avera. Avera means when you violate one of the Torah's native commandments, the Torah's own mitzvahs, Hashem wants you to listen to the government, but you can't call that an avera, he says. So he's inclined to say that it would not be gzela, it would not be mitzvah ba'avera. Furthermore, he argues that Din Malchusa is different from Din Torah. Din Torah, the rules are absolute. We don't make exceptions, and sometimes the halachic process makes exceptions, but in general, you're obligated to follow the letter of the law, the spirit of the law also maybe, but at least the letter of the law, even if you think the reason might not apply in this case, you have to wear tefillin. You can't just say, well, Hashem wants me to remember Avos Hashem and Yiras Hashem, but today I'll remember it without wearing tefillin. It doesn't work like that. You have to wear tefillin. The law, he says, doesn't really work like that. The law, it's all about what the intent of the legislature, what the law really wants, he says. If the law has certain rules, he says, but they don't really care, he says, the law can't make so many distinctions, he says, that the law wants you to be safe, but sukkahs are safe. It's a time-honored tradition. We build sukkahs. There are no safety problems, he says. They don't really mind. They see it. They don't care, he says. You don't need to be such a stickler for the law in such a case. Similarly, he says, if you cross on a red light in the middle of the night where nobody's there are no cars, nobody's looking, he says, then you don't have to be such a stickler for the letter of the law. If it's safe, he says. And therefore he argues that in a case where it's absolutely safe, you don't have to worry about the law. Again, in a case where it's not so safe, like a fire escape, that might be different. You have his first argument, and maybe it's still not called gzeil. On Daf Lamed Beis, we have discussions of different psulim having to do with the mutilation of leaves of a lulav. Again, it starts on Lamed Aleph. Mishnah had said niktam rosho, if the head is cut off. These sugyas are very, very unclear. Niktam and nistak, when it's split, what was cut off? The leaves, the shedra, the spine of the lulav, which leaves, how many leaves? The Gemara says, anyway, with all this ambiguity about which leaves, the Gemara says niktam is possible, but nistak is kosher. If it's cracked, if it's split, that's still kosher. The Gemara asks a stira about nistak, a stira if it's cracked. So the Gemara says, yeah, nistak is normally kosher, but avid kehemnek, if it's like a hemnek, it's like a fork or a split, then that is worse. We'll discuss in more detail what that means soon. Then the Gemara says, Bayer of Papa nechlcha tiyomas mahu, something called the tiyomas, some kind of leaf. The question is, which leaf is split? What's the halacha there? So we paskin that the Gemara brings two opinions about this. Nechlcha is possible, is not possible. We paskin niktam is possible. We paskin that niktam is possible. Nistak is possible if it's like hemnek, and nechlcha is possible as well. In terms of what this means in practice, how we understand all these terms, niktam, the Shulchan Aruch says is possible. Shulchan Aruch says niktam means which leaves, most of the upper leaves. The Ramah says that even the Aleh HaElyon, the way that Chaim explained the Ramah is we know that the middle or the upper leaf, the middle leaf is usually the upper leaf. If that single leaf is split, is niktam, is cut off, that itself is possible, and we are certainly machmer l'chatchila like that. The Ramah says that's only b'di'ika acher. If you have an alternative, like acher, mikra din it's kosher. It could be samech on the other shitas, mikra din it's kosher, and you can make a bracha on such a lulav, even if the middle leaf is niktam. If some lulavim have two leaves in the middle, they end in a binary leaf, meaning two pairs of leaf. Each leaf is doubled over. So if one of them is broken, Mishnah Berurah says efshar diyesh lahakil, then there is basis for leniency. The question is, what does it mean the leaf is cut off? How much has to be cut off? Rosh Zalman Auerbach said it has to be visibly cut off. Rabbi Yashiv said even if you can only see it with a magnifying glass. Certain other psulim will discuss hadar, it doesn't look nice, that's only if you can readily see it, but this psul of being cut off, Rabbi Zalman will still make it, it's only if it's visible, readily visible to the naked eye, but Rabbi Yashiv held even if you need a magnifying glass to detect a tiny bit cut off on top, it is still possible. What about nechlika and nistak? So the Shulchan Aruch says that each lulav leaf normally is double, it's a double leaf stuck together. So nechlika tiyomas is psula. So what is nechlika tiyomes? So again, the Shulchan Aruch seems to understand that that it means most of the leaves. The Shulchan Aruch just says that the baroval, the Beis Yosef said, the Torah Beis Yosef said baroval, most of the leaves are split. That's a pretty bad lulav. That's possible. That wouldn't be such a problem. The problem is the Ramah adds that even if it's the middle leaf, the single middle leaf is split, that's also nechlika tiyomes. And that's, l'chatchila, we say it's possible. That's where one of the biggest headaches of lulav comes, that those middle leaves the single middle leaf is often split. And that, l'chatchila, is possible. L'chatchila, the Ramah says, mitzvah min hamufchar. So the mitzvah min hamufchar, so how much has to be split though? So, we're machmer, that's not just l'chatchila, that we're machmer, haki nagin, we're machmer, we say it's possible, even if just the middle leaf is split. The question is how much? Mikra din, the Ramah says, if it's split all the way down, or the Mishnah Berurah brings from the Gaon of Vilna most of the way down, so from the top of the middle leaf to where it hits the shedra, the thick, heavy part, the spine in the middle, if all or most of that is split, a good few inches down, that's possible, we're machmer mikra din. L'chatchila, mitzvah min hamufchar, the Ramah says, we're machmer that it shouldn't be split at all, because some say even a little bit split is a problem. So how much is a little bit split? Some say it means a tefach, a few inches split, even if it's less than rov. And some say even a mashu, even a tiny bit is split. The reason the Achronim bring for this psul, why is only a little bit split possible? Because when you shake it, it splits more. So even a little bit, if you keep shaking it, it'll eventually split all the way. So l'chatchila mitzvah min hamufchar, Mishabur says that means if you don't have any other lulav, if you have another lulav, then if it's split even a little bit, a tefach or even a mashu, you shouldn't use it. But you don't have to borrow someone else's lulav. If your lulav is split a little bit, you can use it. You don't have to start borrowing a lulav. We obviously don't consider it to be that seriously possible, even though l'chatchila we are machmer. So again, we're machmer for either a mashu, a tiny bit, or for a tefach. Commonly, we have a situation where the lulav is covered with the brown, fibrous, bark-like stuff. Kara, they call it in Hebrew, kufrei shalaf. So, first of all, some say that if it's covered, you can assume it's probably not split. Even if it looks like it's split, some say it is kosher anyway, because if it's being kept together by the kara, some say that, again, you can be lenient. It's not so clear. Many people are makbar on this. They try to find a lulav that they can either recognize as not split or that they find one without kara. But on the other hand, there are those who have the custom. The minhag of the Sfardim in Eretz Yisrael, Shechemet tells us, they definitely used to like having leaves, lulavim that were covered with kara, so that they would keep the top part of the lulav firmly intact. However, Bikuri Yaakov says you shouldn't get a lulav which is entirely covered with kara because you need to do nanum, you need to shake it. And poskim say shaking means the leaves have to rustle. That's why you don't tie the lulav all the way on the top. We say the leaves should rustle, so you shouldn't have kara on the whole lulav, but some say it's actually a good thing to have kara on the top of the lulav. Some are concerned on the contrary. You can't really see if the leaves are split or not. Some don't want kara on the top. There's also a very interesting marsham in Das Torah. There's a whole discussion in general in lulav and estrog when you have problems of pieces broken or split, whether gluing fixes the problem or not. A complex and interesting question. But in this particular case, the marsham says a very strong argument why gluing helps, because if it's split less than rov, it really shouldn't be possible mikra din. Mikra din to be possible should have to be split all the way down or over the way down. Why is a small amount of split possible? Because it will split more as you shake it over yantif. So if you glue it, it won't split more. So that is a very solid heter. So gluing it would be a heter. The post can say if the whole concern is to stop it from splitting more. However, Rav Elyashiv says you, the consumer, you can glue it, but a vendor and a lulav seller can't glue it and sell it to you as perfect because Rav Elyashiv assumes there is a hiddur that it should be totally split without being glued, and if he tells it to you and doesn't disclose it, that's a form of ona and gzela, and he should not do that. The third din we have two dinim so far, niktam, and then we have nechlak, which is pasul, nikra din, we're machmer if it's pasul, if the middle leaf is split most of the way, or if most of the top leaves are split, but we're machmer even if the middle leaf is split, if it's split, rov, and l'chatchila we're machmer even if it's a little bit split. And then we have, the third din is hemnik, the Gemara says, that if the leaves are, even if they're not split all the way, but if there's a crack and it's split it's split far enough apart, the nistak, if it's split far enough apart that even if it's not the tiomes is intact, even if it's not split in a way that it would be possible because of nechlaka tiomes, still if the two parts are like a hemnik, which is like a fork, that they're visible as separate leaves, that itself is possible even if the previous conditions of nechlak don't apply. This is another chumrah people have. Even if it's split only a very small amount on the top, and you don't have to be some machmer on that, but if the two parts that it's split into are deviate from each other and fork like a Y or like a V, that's hemnik. So that's hemnik. So that's possible. Achronim say, however, you shouldn't get too carried away with hemnik. Some people are very concerned that everything is a hemnik, but Achronim say you don't have to be so machmer. The Marsham says that even if the leaf is split, so that when you pick it up, you can see the leaves are there's some spread between them. But if when you put it down on a table, they bump into each other, or when you shake it, the pieces touch. That's called they're not deviating enough to be called a hemnik. Similarly, Chazon Ish says that if they're just slightly apart, that's not hemnik. Hemnik only is when they branch off in different directions. On Daf Lamed Gimel, the Gemara talks about being ma'agid, the lulav, tying it together. Brings the machlokes of Yehuda and the Rabbanan whether lulav tzarech agad or ain't tzarech agad. Rabbi Yehuda holds it's an ikra din daraisa. It's learned from the agudas ezov that you have to tie it together. It's gzera shavu. It's gzera shavu. Lakachtim chem b'yam harishon. Lakachtim agudas ezov. Just like there it says aguda. So here too with lulav you need an aguda. Rabbanan say they don't dash in this gzera shavu. We pass like the Rabbanan, lulav ain't tzarech agad. However, the Gemara goes on. The Gemara says that even according to the Rabbanan, there is a mitzvah to ma'agid. It's not in the Ikra Din, but it's a mitzvah because it's zekei levan veyu. Hiddur mitzvah, to make the mitzvah nice. You're still supposed to be ma'agid it, and that is how we paskin, that we tie the three minim of the lulav together. L'chatchila, because it's zekei levan veyu. There is a question as to how you tie it. So the language of the Shulchan Aruch is that you should have a kesher gomer. It should be tied with a mitzvah la'agdim bekesher gomer, with a proper knot, and not with simply a bow. The Mishnah Berurah says. The Rishonim use language. It has to be a kind of knot that would be austere to tie on Shabbos, a full-blown knot that would be meleches kosher on Shabbos. So poskim debate the way we do it today. We have these holders, the kaisha klach they call it in Yiddish. These holders made out of woven lulav leaves. That's not something that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. It wouldn't seem that way. So the Bikur Yaakov says he's very strict about this. He says that you have to tie it in a kesher that's usher on Shabbos, as the Shulchan Aruch and the poskim say. He says people who just stick their dasim and aravas, they take them in and out of the kesher. The kesher is not tight enough that they can remove the species and put them back in. That's not good enough. He brings the El Yerabah that says that's not good enough. That if they're loose enough that you can take them out, he says that's not a proper agad. Agad is not ma'akev, but l'chatchila you're supposed to have a proper agad. And anything that you can pull them in and out without untying it, that's not tight enough. He says. Even if you have a knot, but if the knot is loose enough that you can slip them in and out, that's not a proper kesher. He says the lulav has to be tied tightly, and when you take the other species in and out, you have to open up the knot because the knot cannot have enough slack that you can remove minim. Also, you tear off the leaves, he says, but besides that, he says if you can take them in and out without untying it, that's not a proper kesher. On the other hand, the Mishnah Berurah does bring that there was a minhag to use. That there was a minhag to use these kinds of baskets. He brings a sefer, a gura ba'alecha. They used to have not a kesher, but they used to build a kind of woven basket, kind of like the kaisha klach, and they would stick the lulav in there. That is good enough. Not so clear if he's being cholek on the Bikur Yaakov, if he held that was better. There are poskim who say, though, that when you put different systems of rings, people have your rings with multiple circles for the different minim. If you use a system like that, that's not a real kesher. There are poskim who say contemporary poskim who say you should also use a proper kesher under the holder, under those rings, a proper kesher, double knot, a tight thing that would be a kesher that you're not allowed to make on Shabbos. I don't think the minhag is like this. I don't think the minhag is to make it so tight people routinely do take their lulavim in and out of the holders. I don't think the minhag is to make it so tight that you can't remove them without untying the knot. But there are Gedolei Achronim, Bikur Yaakov, who say that in order to fulfill the mitzvah of agad properly, and some of the contemporary poskim as well seem to say this, it should really be tied tightly enough. It should be tied with a proper knot, and Bikur Yaakov says even tightly enough that you can't just remove them without untying the knot. On Daf Lamed Daled, we have the discussion of aravas, what aravas are, the different criteria they have to satisfy to be valid aravas. Again, the Mishnah begins on Lamed Gimel. The Sukkah begins on Lamed Gimel. The Gemara says, Arvei Nachal. The Torah describes aravas as they grow on streams, on rivers. So what does that mean actually? Arvei Nachal. So the first pshat is Gedalim al Nachal. They grow on rivers. Davar Acher, that it doesn't mean they grow on rivers at all. It means that the leaves should be mashuf kenachal. They should be straight, elongated like a nachal. The Gemara brings another brisa that says nachal. How do you know if they grow on mountains? If they grow other places, how do you know that's good? Arvei nachal mikol makom madrasha that is good enough. Then the Gemara goes on. What are the simanim of a valid arava as opposed to a tzaftzava, which is not good? Arava has 3 simanim. The kanesh shela is adum, the branch is reddish. Ola shela mashuch, it's elongated. Pia chalak, and it's smooth. Tzaftzava, kanesh shela lavan, it's white. Ola shela agol, the leaves are round rather than elongated. Pia dam lamagal, it's serrated. The Gemara says, but another bride says dam lamagal is kosher, serrated is good. Only dam lamaser is possible. Amrabai kitanyahi bechil fagila. So there are different kinds of serrations. Posting of a lot of discussion about the details of these serrations. We paskin that arava is a min yadua. It has to have these 3 simanim: mashuch kenachal, piv chalak, smooth leaves, and a reddish stem. They add though that even ba'oda yarak, even when it's still green, the stem is green, it's kosher. Why is it kosher if it's green? The Gemara says red. So the Mishnah Berurah brings from the poskim, I think, that as long as it is not actually white is tzaftzafan, it's possible. As long as it's not white, that's red. Red doesn't have to mean actually red. Red means it's not white. And eventually it's going to turn red. When the sun shines in it, it turns red. You find aravas today, the ones they sell, many of them are reddish stemmed and many of them are green, but the halacha is that they are kosher. The Shulchan Aruch does not say anything about growing on a river. And this is actually machlokes achronim. Some achronim say that even though the Gemara says Ainli ala arvei nachal. What about, one brisa says, what about aravas that grow elsewhere? There are poskim who say that l'chatchila, the aravas should grow on a nachal. The Mishnah Berurah says, yesh omrim, l'chatchila, you should take those that actually grow on a river. Others disagree. Others say, ein tzarich l'daktik bazeh. But some say it's a hiddur to get aravas that actually grow on a river. Contemporary poskim discuss all kinds of different species of aravas in Eretz Yisrael, which do meet the simanim, which don't meet the simanim. Different species, I'm not familiar with all of them, where they grow, and so on. One machlokes they bring is about eucalyptus trees. The Maral Diskin said it was kosher because it meets all three simanim. Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank said it was pasul because first of all, most of them don't grow on the river, so it's missing that siman. And second, he said the eucalyptus has a strong odor. Chazal say Rava has no odor, so clearly eucalyptus is the wrong tree. And Moshe Sternbuch as well says that the Shabbat Refuah Shlema says that eucalyptus is not good. Daf Lamed Hey, we talk about chazazis. Chazazis is one of the famous psulim of esrog, that if it has some type of blister, some type of discoloration, then the esrog is pasul. So al rubo is pasul, and miyuto is kosher. The Gemara says. Rav Chisda says that even though we say miyuto is kosher, that's only b'makom echad. If it's shnayim b'shlosha makamos, if it's spotted, it has a bunch of spots, even if it's miyuto, then it is pasul. Rava says al chotmo on a part of the esrog called the chotem, then even mashu nami pasul. And this is how we paskin that there are potentially three psulim of chazazis. One of them is if it's al rubo. Post can discuss exactly what rove the esrog means, but if it's on most of the esrog, that's pasul. Second version of the psul is if it's in 2 or 3 different spots, that's called menumar, spotted like a leopard. That's also pasul. Third psul is b'chotem, it's pasul even a mashu. What is chotmo? There are a variety of different interpretations in the Rishonim. Rashi says ba'ove gavho, the top of the esrog, from where it begins to narrow. Others say it's only on higher up on the esrog where it actually is getting narrow on the top. Some say the pitum is included in the chotem. Chotem is generally assumed to mean somewhere around the top conical portion of the esrog. We pass in all these different dinim of chazazis that it's possible in any of these three variations. The reason chotem is worse is because that's more visible. That's where the eye tends to fall on that part of the esrog. Bir Halacha brings again the different opinions in the Rishonim about what exactly is chotem. Now it says that b'chotem Rava said afilu b'mashu is pasul. Kolshu the Shulchan Aruch says even an arbitrarily small amount. Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah Berurah brings a famous kula from the Mabit hundreds of years ago that kolshu is not literally any tiny amount. It's only if it is readily visible. Nira lakol, it's easily visible. But if you can't see it because it's too small, even if you can see it when you look very closely, you don't need a magnifying glass, but you have to look at it very closely to see it. Ein zeh kolshu shepasul, that's not a problem. So contemporary posts can give different formulations. What does it mean? Where do you hold it? How far away do you hold it? How closely do you have to look? They bring from Rabbi Yashuv and from Mordechai Gross that the distance you hold it is the distance you would normally hold it when you do the mitzvah. You hold it out in front of you. If at that distance from the eye, it has to be, again, readily visible. If you have to look for it carefully to see it, then that's too small and that doesn't count. But if you can readily see it, they say some poskim were famous for doing that. I think they tell it about Rav Yaakov Blau, the legendary posik of the Eidach Haredis, greatest Talmidei Chacham of the 20th century. That I think they say that when they showed him an esrog, he wouldn't get too worked up about it. He'd hold it out at arm's length, give it a quick look, and say, looks good. If you didn't see anything obvious, that you wouldn't examine it that closely. On the other hand, the Briskers are famous for being very meticulous about this. They bring that Rav Chaim Soloveitchik once actually looked at the esrog with a magnifying glass. And the Chazon Ish said, why? Why would you do that? You don't have to. The post can say it's not readily visible. It's not a problem. Rav Chaim said, you're right, Nikra Din, I don't disagree with the halacha, but he thinks there's a hiddur to have an esrog which is completely perfect, even perfect under the glass. As we'll see later, there are other halachas of chazazis which Nikra Din are kosher. It's still a hiddur to get an esrog that's absolutely as clean as you can. Again, we mentioned earlier, some posts can say even the pitum is included in the chotem, and you should avoid having spots on the pitum, which actually is something that happens as well. The Shulchan Aruch says, what is a chazazis? Some kind of blister. It's a blister that has mamash. It has height. You can feel it by running your hand over it. It's not simply a discoloration. The Ramah brings a famous leniency. Therefore, yesh lahachsher, the chazazis that are called blamol, that certain types of discolorations, that are not gavoim, that are just on the surface of the esrog, those are kosher. Others say they're kosher because since they're normal, they come when the esrog grows, these types of spots, we look at that as not an invalid mara at all. Mishnah Berurah explains that means that even if they are a color that's objectively problematic, but if it's a certain type of spot, that's the Vilna Gaon explains this way, even though it's different from the rest of the esrog, but it's called mara esrog because these spots are normal that they grow on the esrog. But Mishnah Berurah says we're not samech on that according to this svara that color is considered a legitimate color because it's normal. That would be true even if they do have height, even if they're raised. That he says that say we're not samech on that unless it's a shas v'tchak. The first svara we're samech on that if it doesn't have, it's not raised, if it's discolorations that are not raised, and if they're not raised, then we are more lenient. So that we're more lenient. Now, furthermore, the poskim Mishnah Berurah brings the poskim say the chazazis is only when it comes naturally from the esrog. If it comes because of thorns, that's kosher. And contemporary poskim say if you have black spots that come externally, they come from pesticides and so on. Black dots that are projected onto the esrog externally, they don't passel. Many acharim say that's not a psul. Rabbi Yashiv held though that sometimes they're not a psul, but if they were driven into the esrog when the esrog was young and they grew up and became part of the esrog, then it could be l'chatchila you shouldn't use that. But in general, the Mishnah Berurah says, but if the problems are in the esrog itself, so we're machmer on raised bumps, even if they're common and they're these things that commonly grow when the esrog grows. But if they're not raised, then we are more lenient. However, despite the fact that these blumel, these types of spots, which are common and natural and part of the esrog's growth, if they're not raised, they're kosher. So nevertheless, Achronim say l'chatchila you should try to avoid them. The Chayadim says that if it's not gavoa, if it's flat, it's matzui, most esrogim have that, then it's fine. It's considered mara esrog. But the Yam Shel Shlomo says amorim merubim, hayodim muatim. It's very hard to get this right. Not everyone knows exactly what kind of spot we're talking about here. Other poskim are not happy with this halacha and don't understand it. Someone who has Yirah Shamayim should try to get an esrog with no chazazis at all. Similarly, Pri Megadim says that Ashrei Mishiyachal Likach Esrog Noah Hadr V'Nakim Mikol. Ideally, one should get an esrog that has perfectly clean. Similar to the Chayadim, that's like what we said before from Rav Chaim that Mikra Din, the halacha allows certain types of blemishes, but certainly it's an ideal to get an esrog that is as clean as you can. On Daf Lamed Vav, again, we have more about the sugya of agad. The Mishnah here talks about agad, tying up the lulav. It says, Ein ogden es lulav el b'mino. You can only do agad, the tying, with the min of the lulav. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. We don't pass like Rabbi Yehuda. We pass like Rabbi Meir, and Meir says, afilu b'chot or mashicha. You can use thread or string. That Rabbi Meir said they used to use gold in Yerushalayim, and they told him no, that they used to use the mino, the minim of the lulav leaf itself, or hadassim branches, or something like that, underneath it. But they use gold to beautify it on the top. We paskin like Rabbi Meir though that you can use anything. They can be yachal agdam b'min acher, anything. It doesn't have to be the 4 species. It should be a double knot. We said it's a mitzvah of zekel banveya. We paskin lulav ein tzorach agad, but the agad can be with anything, even something which is not the species of the lulav, any of the species. Nikra din. That's how we paskin. Not baltosif. It's not considered, adding a new min is not baltosif because it's not a mitzvah to do the agad. It's not a problem of chatzitza because kol naosa in a chotzitz. Mishnah Berurah explains things that are put there to beautify the mitzvah. Kol naosa, it's made for noi, is not chotzitz. So mikra din, it is fine. And most of the poskim say this, that you can use anything you want to tie the lulav. It is universal, however, in my experience, my limited experience, people do use lulav leaves. And nobody uses just twine or wire or rubber bands. People sometimes use those for Hoshanas. They use twist ties or rubber bands. But even there, many people use lulav leaves. And certainly for the lulav itself, pretty much everywhere I've seen, people use either the kaishaklach, which are woven lulav baskets, as we discussed earlier, or rings on top of the kaishaklach, or in addition to the kaishaklach. Everyone that I've seen pretty much uses lulav rings. And there are poskim who say that. They bring Rabbeinu Manoach. One of the Rishonim says that the right thing to do, even though mikra din you can use string, is to use lulav leaves. That's roi lasos. The Kappa Thmarim, or Moshe ben Chaviv, he says chasidim v'anshe ma'isa, those who are meticulous and pious in their conduct, they only use lulav leaves. I'm not sure why. It's a clear Mishnah. It's not a clear Shulchan Aruch that you're allowed to use anything you want. So it's not entirely clear where this chumrah comes from. But these poskim do say that, and that is, again, as far as I've seen, that is the universal minhag in my limited experience to use lulav leaves for the agat.